Hey there, it is nice to meet you. So let's start off with your very first and easiest question. You got a 770 on the GMAT on your first try. No, do not take it again to aim for a 770. In fact, heck nah. You don't want to look like the sort of person who, someone who gets, 770 is already in the 99th percentile. So to aim for a perfect or near perfect score, to be in the 99.9th percentile versus the 99.6th percentile, the added benefit that you're going to get from the effort required to get to that level, it's just going to be so much effort and the payoff is just not worth it. In fact, I actually think it would backfire. If you got a 770 on the first take and then you took it again to get a 790, I think it really runs the risk of having you look like a bit of a difficult person. So don't do it. This is a great GMAT score. Stick with it. So then your leadership experience, you were in the military, the Israeli military, which is sort of famous for being a fairly intense experience. And then you've been working full-time while you've been studying. And during that time, you've been promoted twice, and you're currently working in a department called the Digital and Innovation Department as a project manager. And not only that, so the promotions are great. Working in something called the Digital and Innovation Department is super cool sounding. And not only that, but you've actually worked on something that has positively impact revenues. So I really like this story because it's always nice to be able to show impact to revenues, right? It's one of the easiest ways to prove impact on an organization. A lot of applicants sometimes can't necessarily point to a dollar figure in terms of, here's, the positive impact. I've either saved this much money or I've either made this much money for the company. So no one can really argue with someone's impact. It's if you don't have a dollar figure, if you don't have some sort of a metric to assign to your accomplishment, otherwise it ends up becoming sort of this subjective argument of like, well, I helped influence senior management to do something. It's a lot better when it's all about the Benjamins, or in your case, all about the shekels. So I think this is pretty strong, especially since you're still technically in college. And I also like the fact that your nonprofit work, it's not this sort of random work. One thing that really, bugs me is when people, sometimes you get the sense that people sign up to do volunteer work only because they feel like, oh, I have to do it for my MBA application, so I guess I'll sign up for something random. But in your case, I really like this idea of making the internet habit safer, because I think it ties in really nicely with the online publishing story. I think there's a lot of controversy right now. The biggest issue with online publishing right now is what's going to be a viable business model for the next 10, 20, 40 years. But then beyond that, the other sort of controversy with digital publishing, or the publishing industry in general, is, are some of these habits that, these comment sections, for instance, that get so toxic, right? Is that a best practice or isn't it? And the trolls that sometimes inhabit that space. So I think this actually ties in really nicely thematically with working for a publishing company. So I like this a lot. In terms of your career goals, the first one, saying you want to continue to work in the publishing industry, sort of at the intersection of innovation and publishing, I think that makes so much more sense. Please don't say that you want to work in consulting or private equity. Especially not private consulting. I guess maybe, you can make the typical argument of like, oh, it will let me see best practices across several industries or several clients or what have you. In real life, go for it. Right? If you get into business school, go for it. Try for those consulting jobs. But in terms of the story just gets so much cleaner if you talk about wanting to help the publishing industry figure out some of these challenges that it's facing. Now, your drawbacks that you identify, I actually didn't identify these as drawbacks per se. Lack of international experience, that's fine. It is what it is. I don't think it's such a drawback, so I wouldn't call it necessarily a drawback. Low GPA, you say that you're a little bit above the average. So if you graduate with some sort of honors, or if you can sort of point to being, class rank, I guess what you're trying to tell me is that you're in the top 50% of the class. But honestly, low GPA is the easiest admissions sin to overcome in my experience. And trust me, that 770 on the GMAT is going to, as far as I'm concerned, between the 770 on the GMAT and the fact that you have been working full time, I'm not worried about the GPA. So you can explain it, you suppose. You say, I can explain it, I suppose, by citing your full-time employment. Yes, you can write for virtually every school something called an optional essay in which you can explain that there was full-time employment. And then I was really puzzled by this here. You say, well, I'm a little bit worried about my mediocre leadership experience. I think for someone, especially someone who is technically still in college, your leadership experience seems pretty cool, especially, the editorial board stuff is okay, but this digital and innovation department stuff, wow, I highlighted it for a reason. That's super cool. And so if you have been leading projects as a project manager there, especially since you're still in college, I don't necessarily think that the leadership seems poor. And no one will ever argue that a stint in the Israeli military bodes poorly for leadership development, right? I mean, it's a pretty famous leadership experience. So I don't necessarily have some of these same concerns that you have. Moving on, you continued to ask, you're looking for a suitable U.S. 2-year program. So I think apart from the usual suspects, sort of being the top programs that everyone looks at, I think for you, I put Columbia, Wharton, NYU as the first three that came to mind. Definitely Columbia and NYU. I think for publishing especially, you're going to want to be as close to New York City as possible because New York City is the center of the publishing universe. So by going to school in New York City, you're going to have the opportunity to not just simply network with a lot of these companies, but in fact, I know Columbia most certainly has a term time internship program. So you not only get your summer internship when you're at Columbia, you also get the added benefit and added opportunity of being able to intern while you're during the school year, while you're studying. So I would definitely look at Columbia. I think for you, Columbia is such a strong choice. I actually, we're going to get to when I think you should apply in a minute, but I think when you do apply to Columbia, I do think you should maybe even consider making it early decision, making it sort of your first choice. I just see so much benefit to you being in the New York area that it's almost a no-brainer. Wharton is not in New York City. It's not like super close, but it's close enough to be within the universe. It's a train ride away. And Wharton, I think, also does some good stuff with media. Some other sort of ones that you might want to look into in terms of, does the curriculum match what you're interested in? MIT has the Media Lab, so if you were to go to Sloan for your MBA, you would be able to participate in activities and coursework with the MIT Media Lab. It's kind of a famous thing. The projects that they are interested in may or may not be up your alley, but it's worth checking out. And then I think maybe UCLA and USC, the two main Los Angeles schools, have very, very strong MBA of entertainment, media and entertainment programs. Although I have to admit, and I live in Los Angeles, so I always want people to move here, but even I have to admit that publishing really is much, much, much more of a New York City industry than an LA industry. So I still heavily favor the New York City schools for you. Should you apply for a deferred admission program? I mean, look, you might want to reach out to some of the admissions offices and ask, because it's such a complicated thing, right? Because you've had the full-time military service. So I think some people would say, well, technically they're not supposed to have full-time service, but then again, you're still technically getting your undergraduate degree. So it's sort of disqualifying if you would have done the military service post getting your undergraduate degree, then clearly you would not be eligible. But since you got it in the middle of your undergraduate degree, this is a tough one. It's a real tricky one, and I'm not sure, but you might want to just reach out to some of the schools and just ask, right? Drop them a note. Believe it or not, they're real humans, real human beings on the other side. So you can just drop their admissions offices a note and ask if you're and ask if the military service sort of disqualifies you, because presumably you were not going to school. You've been going to school while you've been working full-time at the publishing company, but presumably you were doing this full-time without going to school at the same time. So, man, I don't know. So just ask them, right? And if you can still apply, go for it. So as you might know, the deferred admissions programs are HBS 2+2. Stanford has a deferred admission program, and Yale has something called the Silver Scholars Program that you might want to look at. And if you're not eligible, or if you do apply this year and it doesn't work out, by the way, there is literally no downside to apply. If you're qualified, if you're allowed to apply to these programs, there's no downside to doing it. Even if you get rejected this year, as they like to say, when you apply for the sort of deferred admissions program, those early admissions programs, a no doesn't mean not ever. It just means not now sometimes. So there's no, it won't hurt any future application if you were to apply to 2+2. So definitely go for it. And if not, then, as you might know, the typical average years of work experience for post-MBA is sort of 4 to 6 years. But given your age, given the 3 years of military experience, and given that you've had the equivalence of a couple of years of full-time work experience, maybe then wait 2 years of, I wrote post-MBA experience, that's a typo, sorry, I meant post, when you graduate from law school, right? So I think if it doesn't work out for whatever reason this year, then maybe wait 2 years and then give that a try, because that way you'll be sort of at the maturity level, that since the average age at a lot of these programs is around 27-ish, then at that point you're 25 now, so that'll kind of put you squarely in the right age range. Now, granted, chronological age normally does not mean as much as years of post-graduation work experience. That's how sometimes you hear of people who are like, oh, I'm 32 and I got into HBS, but frequently those are people who were doing other things with their lives, and so their post, maybe they got a doctorate, for example, and so their post number of years of postdoctorate work experience is still only 4 or 5 years, right? So chronologically they may be 31, but in terms of work experience they might be 4 or 5 years out. In your case, the opposite might actually kind of work, where you might be sort of a competitive candidate in 2 years if we consider your 3 years of military experience as quote unquote experience, and if we also consider your full-time during college work experience as also experience as well. So that's what I would tell you to do. I probably go for it this year. Why not, for the early deferral programs, and then maybe wait 2 years. And this is, by the way, this is why going to events like MBA fairs, or if the admissions office is visiting your city, this is why it's great to go to these events. Try to get to them if you can, and just ask. Also start networking with people. In Applicant Lab, I have a ton of advice for how to start networking, how to find the people who can help guide you, because surely you're not the first. I actually had someone in my section at HBS who was from Israel, and she had been in the military as well, and I actually frankly don't know if she, if they counted those 3 years as, she was definitely not 2+2, at least not as far as I know. So I don't know if those 3 years count as sort of quote unquote full-time work experience or not, but the more you reach out to other Israelis who have been through this process, they are going to be in a much better position to tell you how that facet of your profile is going to be evaluated. So best of luck. In Applicant Lab, I have a ton of advice on not only how to do some of these informational interviews and how to track down people who are like you and what to say to them once you get them on the phone, but I also have advice for the career vision, for example. So I would explain in there, hopefully after going through the career vision module, you would see why, for example, private equity is probably a pretty fatal career vision to apply with. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.